Welcome. Find a comfortable position, let your breathing settle into its natural rhythm, and prepare to journey back through millennia to a world both strange and familiar. Tonight, we travel to ancient Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, where civilization itself first took shape in the shifting sands and fertile plains of what is now Iraq. Imagine yourself transported more than 4,000 years into the past, to a time before Rome, before Athens, before the pyramids reached their full glory. Here, in the valleys carved by the Tigris and Euphrates, human beings first gathered in true cities, first pressed reed styluses into soft clay to record their thoughts, first divided their days by the movement of celestial bodies across an endless sky. The world you're about to enter is one of contradictions. Great temples rise above humble villages. Magnificent gardens bloom in a harsh, unforgiving landscape. Advanced astronomical knowledge exists alongside back-breaking agricultural labor. Empires rise and fall like the rivers themselves, flooding with ambition, receding into memory. Over the next hours, you will walk through 4 distinct experiences of Mesopotamian life. First, you'll feel the weight of a wooden plow in your calloused hands as a Sumerian farmer, laboring under the relentless sun. Then you'll witness the momentous fall of mighty Babylon to Persian conquest. You'll explore the silent halls of an ancient library where humanity's earliest literature awaits on countless clay tablets. And finally, you'll stand in wonder before hanging gardens and glazed brick gates in a city that defined magnificence for the ancient world. Let the present fade. Let your modern concerns drift away like dust on a desert wind. The ancient world awaits, patient and eternal, ready to share its stories with those willing to listen. The sun has not yet risen, but already you are awake. In the pre-dawn darkness of your small mud-brick dwelling, you can hear the gentle stirring of your family. Your wife preparing the morning meal, your children beginning to wake. The air inside is cool now. A brief respite before the heat of the day transforms your single-room home into an oven of baked earth. You are a farmer in the land of Sumer, in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. Your world is bounded by the temple complex that dominates the horizon to the north, and the irrigation canals that snake through the landscape like the veins of some great sleeping giant. You do not own the land you work. It belongs to the temple of Enlil, the storm god, and you are merely one among many who toil to produce the barley, dates, and onions that feed the city and fill the temple's vast storehouses. Step outside into the gradually lightening world. The air carries the scent of the river, that peculiar mixture of silt and vegetation that has defined this land since before memory. In the distance, you can hear the lowing of oxen, the bleating of sheep, the first stirrings of a community awakening to another day of unending labor. Your first task, as it is most mornings, is to inspect the irrigation channels that feed your assigned plot of land. This is not optional work, not something you can delay or ignore. In Mesopotamia, water is life itself, and the complex network of canals, dikes, and drainage systems represents thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and constant maintenance. The rivers that give this land its fertility also threaten it with unpredictable floods and shifting courses. Without irrigation, the fields would be dust within weeks. You walk along the narrow earthen banks of the smaller channels, your bare feet finding purchase on ground that has been walked smooth by generations of farmers before you. The water flows sluggishly in the pre-dawn light, its surface catching the first hints of approaching sunrise. You're looking for breaks in the channel walls, for signs of silt accumulation that might restrict flow, for evidence that your upstream neighbors have been taking more than their allocated share. This vigilance is necessary because the consequences of neglect are swift and severe. Last year, a section of the main canal collapsed during the spring floods, and 3 entire fields were washed away, their carefully tended crops destroyed in a matter of hours. The farmers responsible were brought before the temple authorities, stripped of their allotments, and reduced to working as day laborers for others. Their families faced hunger that winter, dependent on the charity of the temple's grain distributions. The irrigation system is a wonder of human ingenuity, but it is also a demanding master. Every farmer owes corvée labor to the temple and the palace, days or weeks each year spent not on your own fields but on the communal infrastructure that makes all agriculture possible. You dig new channels under the direction of the temple's overseers. You repair flood damage. You dredge accumulated silt from major waterways. You build up earthen dams and dikes. The work is hard, the days long, and the compensation minimal, perhaps a ration of barley and beer, nothing more. By the time you return to your house, the sun has fully risen, transforming the landscape from soft shadows to harsh, brilliant light. Your wife hands you a piece of flatbread, still warm from the simple clay oven, and a small cup of beer. Not the recreational beverage of later eras, but a thick, nutritious drink full of grains and sediment, more food than refreshment. This is breakfast for most Sumerians, a simple meal consumed quickly before the real work of the day begins. You gather your tools, a wooden plow with a bronze-tipped point, a cedar plow that allows you to plant as you break the earth, a simple hoe for detailed work. Your 2 oxen, valuable beyond measure, wait patiently. These animals represent a massive investment, one that most farmers cannot afford individually. You share these oxen with 3 other farming families, which means coordinating your plowing schedule, ensuring the animals are properly fed and watered, and accepting that sometimes you must wait days for your turn while others use the oxen for their own fields. The field before you stretches in rectangular precision, bounded by low earthen ridges that help contain irrigation water. The soil here is rich, dark, and heavy with silt deposited by countless floods over countless centuries. But it is also increasingly problematic. You can see the white crystals forming on the surface in some areas, salt, the gradual poison that is slowly destroying Sumerian agriculture. This salinization is a crisis no one fully understands, though its effects are impossible to ignore. Each year, the salt content increases as irrigation water evaporates, leaving its mineral content behind. Each year, the barley yields decrease slightly. Some fields that were productive in your grandfather's time now lie abandoned, too salty to support any growth. The priests make offerings to the gods, seeking divine intervention, but the White Death continues its inexorable advance. You guide the plow into position, feel the oxen lean into the yoke, and begin the slow, methodical work of breaking the earth. The plow point cuts through the soil with a sound like tearing cloth, turning over the earth in long, straight furrows. This is skilled work, requiring constant attention to depth, straightness, and spacing. Plow too shallow, and the seeds will not take root. Plow too deep, and you waste energy and risk breaking the bronze plow point. Plow crooked, and the irrigation water will not flow properly through the field. The heat builds steadily as the morning progresses. By mid-morning, the temperature has become almost unbearable. The sun beats down with an intensity unknown to more temperate regions, and there is virtually no shade on the open plain. Sweat soaks through your simple woolen tunic, and dust clings to your damp skin. You take periodic breaks to drink from the water skin you've brought, but you cannot afford to rest long. There are still many furrows to complete, and if you fall behind schedule, you risk missing the optimal planting window. Around you, the landscape shimmers with heat. Other farmers work their own plots, each a small figure in the vast agricultural complex that surrounds the city. In the distance, the ziggurat of the temple complex rises like a mountain, its mud brick terraces climbing toward the sky, where the gods are believed to dwell. From your perspective in the field, the temple seems impossibly large, a physical manifestation of the divine power that orders your existence. You do not question this order. The concept of working land that you yourself own is alien, almost unthinkable. The temple has always controlled the land. The temple has always organized the irrigation. The temple has always collected its due in exchange for maintaining the cosmic order that keeps the rivers flowing and the harvests coming. To imagine otherwise would be to imagine a world without sun or moon. Theoretically possible, perhaps, but practically meaningless. By midday, you have completed perhaps a quarter of the field. The oxen are tired, their flanks heaving with exertion despite the relatively cool morning start. You lead them to a small canal where they can drink, then allow them to rest in the minimal shade provided by a cluster of date palms at the field's edge. These palms are themselves a crop, though one that requires less constant attention than the barley. The dates they produce are a crucial part of the Sumerian diet, providing concentrated sweetness and energy that barley alone cannot match. Your midday meal is simple: more bread, perhaps some dried fish if you've been fortunate, and always beer. You eat mechanically, barely tasting the food, your mind already calculating the work remaining. After the ploughing comes planting, then the constant vigilance of the growing season. Monitoring irrigation, pulling weeds, watching for pests and diseases. Then harvest, perhaps the most labor-intensive period of all, when every hand is needed to bring in the crop before the weather turns or raiders strike. Raiders. The thought is never far from your mind. The open plains between the rivers are vulnerable to incursions from nomadic tribes who sweep in from the desert, taking what they want and disappearing before any organized resistance can be mounted. Just last season, a group of raiders struck a village only a day's walk from here, carrying off grain, livestock, and several young women. The temple's soldiers eventually tracked them down and exacted revenge, but the damage was done. Lives disrupted or ended, wealth stolen that could never be fully recovered. Security is another service the temple provides, another reason for the heavy taxes you pay. Temple soldiers patrol the region, guard the irrigation infrastructure, and theoretically protect farmers like you from external threats. In practice, their protection is imperfect, their response often too slow to prevent losses. But without them, the situation would undoubtedly be worse, the raids more frequent and devastating. The afternoon stretches on, each hour marked by the sun's slow journey across the cloudless sky. You return to the plough, the oxen patient and long-suffering as they once again lean into the yoke. The bronze plough point cuts through the earth, and behind it, the cedar attachment drops barley seeds at measured intervals. This is sophisticated technology by the standards of the age, though operating it is far from easy. The cedar frequently jams, requiring you to stop and clear compacted seeds. The distribution is imperfect, leaving some areas overplanted and others sparse. As you work, your mind wanders to the upcoming tax assessment. Representatives from the temple will arrive after the harvest to evaluate your yield and determine what portion belongs to the god, which is to say, to the temple institution that manages the god's earthly affairs. The assessment is theoretically based on the field's productivity, but in practice, it often feels arbitrary, subject to the whims and prejudices of the scribes who record everything in their mysterious wedge-shaped marks on clay tablets. These scribes occupy a position in society utterly beyond your reach. They are literate in a world where literacy is rare and powerful. They can record transactions, write contracts, send messages across great distances, and preserve knowledge across generations. Their skill with the stylus opens doors to administrative positions, to comfortable lives spent indoors rather than laboring under the merciless sun. You will never be a scribe. Your children will almost certainly never be scribes. That path requires years of training in the temple schools, training available only to those with wealth and connections. Instead, your children will be farmers, as you are, as your father was, as his father was before him. Your daughter will marry another farmer, moving to his household and beginning the same cycle of labor and childbearing that has defined women's lives for generations. Your sons will work alongside you in the fields, learning the rhythms of plowing and planting, irrigation and harvest, until they are old enough to be assigned their own plots or to continue working the family's allotment after you are gone. The sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, and the heat, while still intense, becomes slightly more bearable. You have completed another section of the field, the furrows running straight and true, the seeds distributed in the earth's dark embrace. Tomorrow, you will open the irrigation gates and flood this section, watching carefully to ensure the water flows evenly, not pooling in low spots or rushing too quickly through high ones. As dusk approaches, you lead the exhausted oxen back toward the village. Your own exhaustion is profound, a bone-deep weariness that comes from hours of physical labor in extreme heat. Your shoulders ache from guiding the plow. Your back protests with every step. Your hands are cramped from gripping the wooden handles. This is normal. This is every day. This is life. The village appears ahead, a cluster of mud brick structures that seem to emerge organically from the landscape, as if the earth itself has decided to take on regular geometric forms. Smoke rises from evening cooking fires. The smell of baking bread mingles with the ever-present scent of the river. Children play in the narrow streets, their laughter a brief respite from the gravity of adult concerns. Your house, when you reach it, is both refuge and reminder. The single room serves every purpose, sleeping, eating, storing the limited possessions that constitute your household wealth. The mud brick walls are thick, providing some insulation from the heat, but they also require constant maintenance. The autumn rains, when they come, will test every wall, every roof beam, every plastered surface. Already you can see small cracks forming, places where the mud has dried and shrunk, creating vulnerabilities that will worsen if not addressed. Your wife has prepared the evening meal, a barley stew with onions and perhaps a small amount of mutton, a luxury afforded by the recent festival when the temple distributed meat to the workers. The stew is flavored with bitter herbs gathered from the edges of the irrigation canals, and it is served with the inevitable flatbread and beer. You eat in the gathering darkness, too tired for much conversation, the meal a simple biological necessity rather than a source of pleasure. After eating, there is still work to be done. Tools must be cleaned and stored. The oxen must be fed their ration of barley straw and checked for injuries or signs of illness. Your wife mends a tear in one of your children's tunics by the light of a small oil lamp, the precious oil carefully rationed to make it last. Tomorrow there will be water to carry from the canal, bread to bake, endless small tasks that maintain a household's basic functioning. The night sounds of the village settle around you. Distant conversations, a baby crying, dogs barking at shadows or memories. The stars emerge in vast profusion, those same eternal points of light that your ancestors watched and that some priests claim to understand, seeing in their movements the will of the gods and the fate of kings. You think about the coming season. If the harvest is good, if the taxes are not too severe, if no raiders strike, if disease does not decimate the village, if the irrigation holds and the salt does not advance too far, then perhaps you will survive another year with a small surplus stored against harder times. If any of these conditions fail, hunger becomes a real possibility, the specter that haunts every agricultural community living at the edge of subsistence. Sleep comes quickly when you finally lie down on your reed mat. Your body demands rest, and you surrender to it without resistance. Tomorrow will bring the same routine, the same labor, the same small victories and setbacks that constitute existence. The seasons will turn. The rivers will flood and recede. Empires may rise or fall in the great cities, but here in the fields, life continues in patterns established millennia ago and destined to continue for millennia more. This is the reality of the common farmer in ancient Sumer, not the builders of ziggurats or the writers of epic poetry, but the uncounted thousands whose labor made civilization possible. Their names are not recorded on clay tablets. Their achievements are not celebrated in temple inscriptions. Yet without them, the great cities would starve. The temples would stand empty, and the very concept of civilization would collapse back into the dust from which it emerged. Imagine yourself in their place, and perhaps the weight of your own daily concerns becomes lighter by comparison. Or perhaps you recognize in their struggles something eternal about the human condition, the need to eat, to shelter one's family, to find meaning in repetitive labor, to hope for a future marginally better than the present. The details change across millennia, but the fundamental challenges remain surprisingly constant. The Sumerian farmer sleeps, dreamless and exhausted, while above him the stars wheel through their ancient courses, indifferent to human struggle, eternal witnesses to the brief bright spark of individual lives in the vast darkness of time. The transition from farmer to witness of empire may seem abrupt, but in Mesopotamia these worlds were never truly separate. The decisions of kings rippled outward through irrigation systems and tax burdens, through conscripted soldiers pulled from their fields, through the stability or chaos that determined whether crops could be planted and harvested in peace. Now we move forward in time from the early Sumerian period to the 6th century before the Common Era to witness a transformation that would reshape the entire ancient Near East. The year is 539 BCE, and the great city of Babylon stands at a crossroads. For nearly a century, it has been the capital of an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Its walls are legendary, its temples magnificent, its reputation as the greatest city in the world seemingly secure. Yet within those imposing fortifications, discontent festers like an untreated wound, and to the east, a new power rises with relentless ambition. Imagine yourself as a resident of Babylon in these final years of independence. Perhaps you are a merchant whose livelihood depends on the trade routes that connect distant lands. Perhaps you are a priest serving in one of the city's countless temples. Perhaps you are simply an ordinary citizen, watching the grand pageant of history unfold around you, powerless to influence its course, but deeply affected by its consequences. The current king, Nabonidus, is an unusual ruler, a man whose priorities perplex and anger many of his subjects. Unlike his predecessors, who carefully maintained Babylon's religious traditions and honored Marduk, the city's patron deity, Nabonidus has elevated the moon god Sin to preeminence in the Babylonian pantheon. This is not merely a personal preference, but a deliberate religious policy that disrupts centuries of established practice. For the priests of Marduk's temple, this represents an intolerable affront. Marduk has been promoted by earlier Neo-Babylonian kings as the empire's chief deity, the divine patron whose favor ensures Babylon's prosperity and power. The elaborate New Year festivals that honor Marduk and symbolically renew the king's mandate to rule are central to Babylonian identity and civic life. Yet Nabonidus has repeatedly failed to celebrate these crucial rituals. For years at a time, he absents himself from the capital, dwelling instead in the Arabian oasis of Tamar, pursuing his devotion to Sin while leaving his son Belshazzar to manage affairs in Babylon. The king's inscriptions record his clashes with Marduk's powerful priesthood, and his own writings focus obsessively on Sin, barely mentioning Marduk at all. The people of Babylon watch this religious upheaval with growing unease. Religion in Mesopotamia is not separate from civic life, but intimately woven into it. The gods maintain cosmic order. The proper performance of rituals ensures agricultural fertility, military victory, and social stability. When a king disrupts these ancient patterns, he threatens the very foundations upon which civilization rests. Beyond the religious controversy, Nabonidus faces practical challenges. His attempts to centralize religious authority in Babylon alienate local priesthoods throughout the empire. Regional temples, accustomed to their own autonomy and traditions, resent the king's interference. The bonds that hold the empire together begin to fray. Meanwhile, to the east, Cyrus of Persia builds an empire with methodical brilliance. He first overthrows his overlord, the Median king Astyages, in 550 BCE, when Astyages' own army betrays him and sides with the Persian upstart. Cyrus establishes his rule at Ecbatana, ending the Median Empire and elevating the Persians to dominant status among the Iranian peoples. From this power base, Cyrus expands in all directions. He conquers Lydia in Anatolia, subduing the fabulously wealthy King Croesus. He brings the Greek cities of the Ionian coast under Persian control. He secures his eastern frontiers in regions that will later be called Afghanistan and Central Asia. By 540 BCE, the Persian Empire encircles Babylonia, and Cyrus initiates an offensive campaign against the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The strategic situation for Babylon is dire. Cyrus commands an army battle hardened by years of conquest, loyal to a king who has brought them victory after victory. The Babylonian military, by contrast, has not faced a major external threat for decades. The empire's subject peoples, observing Nabonidus's religious peculiarities and the growing Persian power, begin to calculate where their loyalties should lie. In 539 BCE, Cyrus invades. His army moves through Mesopotamia with the confidence of an inevitable force. The Persian strategy is not merely military but also political. Cyrus presents himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator, a champion of Marduk who will restore proper religious observance that Nabonidus has disrupted. This message resonates powerfully with the Babylonian priesthood and populace. The decisive military engagement occurs in September 539 BCE at the Battle of Opis, a strategic riverside city north of Babylon itself. Here, the Babylonian army, a mixture of Nabonidus's regular forces and Akkadian contingents, faces the Persian military machine. The details of the fighting are sparse in the historical record, but the outcome is unambiguous, a crushing Persian victory. Some accounts suggest that Belshazzar, Nabonidus's son and regent in Babylon, is killed in the battle or in rioting that accompanies it. The Babylonian defensive position collapses. Cyrus's forces drain or cross the Tigris River, outflanking the Median Wall, the great defensive barrier that was supposed to protect Babylonia from northern invasion. With Opis fallen, Cyrus splits his forces. He sends his general Gubaru with Persian troops south toward Babylon itself, while Cyrus personally moves southwest to capture Sippar, another key city. Sippar surrenders without significant resistance, its garrison recognizing the futility of opposition. Now comes one of the most remarkable moments in ancient military history. In October 539 BCE, Persian forces approach Babylon, the greatest fortified city in the world, protected by walls so massive they seem almost mythological. Yet the city that should require months or years of siege warfare falls with barely a struggle. The sources disagree on the precise mechanics of Babylon's capture. The Babylonian Chronicles and the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay cylinder inscribed with Cyrus official propaganda, claim the city was taken without battle. Greek historians Herodotus and Xenophon tell more dramatic stories of the Euphrates River being diverted, allowing Persian troops to enter through the dry riverbed beneath the city's water gates. The biblical book of Daniel adds its own theological interpretation to events. What seems clear is that significant elements within Babylon actively facilitated the Persian takeover. A turncoat Babylonian governor assists Cyrus at Opis. The priests of Marduk, alienated by Nabonidus, see the Persian king as a preferable alternative. When Cyrus enters Babylon, he is proclaimed not as a foreign conqueror, but as the rightful king of Babylonia, chosen by Marduk himself to restore proper order. Imagine yourself in Babylon on that October day when the Persians arrive. The massive gates that have protected the city for generations stand open. Foreign soldiers march through streets where Babylonian armies once paraded in triumph. Yet there is no mass slaughter, no wholesale destruction, no sack of the temples that conquerors usually inflict on defeated cities. Instead, Cyrus displays a calculated tolerance that becomes a hallmark of Persian imperial policy. He honors Marduk and the Babylonian gods, participating in their traditional rituals. He claims not to have conquered Babylon, but to have been invited by Marduk to rescue the city from Nabonidus's misrule. He allows exiled peoples, including the Jews deported by earlier Babylonian kings, to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. This policy is not mere humanitarian sentiment, but shrewd imperial strategy. Cyrus understands that empires cannot be held by force alone, that accommodation and respect for local traditions create more stable rule than constant suppression. By honoring the gods of conquered peoples, he gains their loyalty, or at least their acquiescence. By allowing a degree of local autonomy, he reduces the administrative burden of empire and the likelihood of constant rebellions. For Nabonidus, the end comes with less clarity than one might expect for a deposed king. Some sources suggest he surrenders and is taken prisoner, perhaps dying in captivity the following year. Other accounts are silent on his fate, allowing him to fade from history as his empire faded into Persian control. The fall of Babylon marks a profound transition in Near Eastern history. For more than 1,000 years, Mesopotamia has been the heartland of empire, the region where civilization's greatest achievements have been concentrated. Now, power shifts to Persia, to an Iranian people who adopt and adapt Mesopotamian culture while adding their own distinctive elements. The conquest also demonstrates the fragility of even the mightiest empires. Babylon's walls could not save it when internal divisions weakened the social fabric. Military strength proved insufficient when political legitimacy was undermined. The priests of Marduk, guardians of tradition, became agents of regime change when their interests aligned with foreign invasion. For the common people of Babylon, the change of rulers likely meant less than we might imagine. Taxes still needed to be paid, though now to Persian rather than Babylonian administrators. Fields still needed to be tended, irrigation canals maintained, children raised, and daily life navigated. The grand conflicts of kings and empires form the dramatic narrative of history, but for most people, existence continues in familiar patterns, regardless of which language the tax collector speaks. Yet something has ended, irretrievably and forever. Babylon will remain a great city for centuries to come, still magnificent, still a center of learning and culture, but it will never again be the capital of an independent Mesopotamian empire. The long arc of Babylonian political sovereignty, stretching back through Hammurabi to the first Sumerian city-states, has reached its conclusion. Persian rule will last for 2 centuries, a period of relative stability and prosperity under the Achaemenid dynasty. The empire Cyrus founded will expand even further, eventually stretching from Egypt to India, the largest contiguous empire the world has yet seen. Babylon will be one jewel among many in the Persian crown, honored and preserved, but no longer paramount. The priests of Marduk, who perhaps thought they were simply replacing one king with another more favorable to their interests, could not have foreseen the longer trajectory. They traded Babylonian independence for Persian protection of their temple privileges. In the immediate term, this seemed like a reasonable exchange. Cyrus honored his promises, restored the religious festivals, and presented himself as Marduk's chosen servant. But empires have their own logic, their own inevitable evolution. What begins as respectful partnership gradually becomes subordination. Later, Persian kings will be less scrupulous about Babylonian sensibilities. The unique character of Mesopotamian civilization will slowly blur into the broader Persian imperial culture, distinct but no longer dominant. Walk through Babylon in the weeks after Cyrus's arrival. The city appears unchanged, the same massive walls, the same great temples, the same bustling markets and residential quarters. Yet everything has changed. The cosmic order that placed Marduk and Babylon at the center of the civilized world has been disrupted. A new order has arrived, one centered on Persepolis and Susa rather than Babylon, honoring Ahura Mazda alongside the traditional Mesopotamian deities. For those living through these events, the full significance is impossible to grasp. History is experienced day by day, decision by decision, without knowledge of how later generations will interpret and categorize these moments. The fall of Babylon seems momentous, certainly, but also perhaps temporary, a reversible political change rather than a civilizational watershed. Yet we, looking back across millennia, can see what they could not. A turning point, an ending and a beginning. The close of one historical epoch and the opening of another. Mesopotamian civilization does not disappear. Its cultural achievements, its literature, its mathematical and astronomical knowledge will persist and influence all subsequent Near Eastern cultures. But political power has shifted permanently eastward to peoples who were once peripheral to the Mesopotamian heartland. The night falls on Babylon, as it has for thousands of years. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, the same constellations Sumerian priests observed and catalogued centuries before. The Euphrates flows past the city walls, indifferent to human politics, carrying silt from distant mountains to the Persian Gulf, as it has since before human memory. Inside the city, people sleep, their dreams perhaps troubled by uncertainty about the future, perhaps relieved that the change of power occurred without the mass slaughter that often accompanies conquest. Tomorrow, they will wake to a world both familiar and strange, where the daily routines continue, but within a new political framework, under new masters who speak a different language and worship different gods alongside the traditional Mesopotamian pantheon. This is how empires fall, not always in apocalyptic violence, but sometimes in negotiated surrender, in calculated betrayal, in the quiet opening of gates to foreign armies when resistance seems futile and accommodation seems wise. The end of Babylonian independence comes not with a dramatic final stand, but with a pragmatic recognition of reality, a collective decision by priests and officials that survival and continuity matter more than abstract sovereignty. Let this knowledge settle gently in your mind as you prepare to move forward through our journey. The rise and fall of empires, the great dramas of conquest and defeat, play out against the backdrop of ordinary lives, continuing in their necessary patterns. Kings may come and go, but the fields must still be planted, the bread must still be baked, and children must still be raised to adulthood. The eternal and the ephemeral intertwine, neither fully separable from the other, together constituting the vast, complex tapestry of human history. From the movements of armies and the fall of empires, we turn now to something quieter, but perhaps more enduring, the preservation of knowledge itself. Move backward in time from Babylon's surrender to a century earlier, to the 7th century BCE, to the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, where a king named Ashurbanipal assembled what would become one of the most significant collections of written knowledge in the ancient world. Imagine yourself standing in the royal palace at Nineveh, in a room unlike any other in the Assyrian Empire. The walls are lined with niches and shelving, and on these shelves rest thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, each one carefully inscribed with the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script. The air is cool and dry, conditions deliberately maintained to preserve these fragile repositories of human thought. This is the library of Ashurbanipal, and you are in the presence of over 30,000 tablets representing the accumulated knowledge of Mesopotamian civilization. King Ashurbanipal, who ruled Assyria from 668 to approximately 631 BCE, was an unusual monarch for his time. Unlike many rulers who valued only military prowess and administrative efficiency, Ashurbanipal took pride in his literacy, a skill rare even among the elite. He could read and write both Akkadian and Sumerian, the ancient liturgical language that by his time had been dead for over a millennium. He understood the power of knowledge and sought to gather it systematically, creating a library that would serve both as a practical resource and as a monument to Assyrian cultural achievement. The creation of this library was not a passive act of collecting whatever texts happened to be available. Ashurbanipal dispatched scribes throughout his empire with explicit instructions to find, copy, and bring back texts from temple libraries, private collections, and scholarly centers. After his conquest of Babylon in 649 or 648 BCE, many texts were transported directly from Babylonian libraries to Nineveh, both as spoils of war and as acknowledgement of Babylon's reputation as a center of learning. The king's agents sought specific categories of knowledge. They collected omen texts, elaborate compilations that interpreted celestial phenomena, the behavior of animals, the patterns in smoke rising from incense, anything that might reveal the will of the gods. They gathered medical treatises describing symptoms, treatments, and magical incantations to drive out disease-causing demons. They acquired hymns, prayers, and ritual instructions for the countless ceremonies that maintained cosmic order. They copied out literary works, historical chronicles, and astronomical observations spanning centuries. Consider the process by which these tablets entered the library. A scribe, having located an important text in a distant temple, would carefully copy it onto fresh clay tablets. The work required extraordinary precision, for a single misplaced wedge mark could alter meaning or render a passage incomprehensible. The scribe worked methodically, pressing a sharpened reed stylus into moist clay, creating the characteristic wedge shapes that gave cuneiform its name. Each tablet, once inscribed, followed a standard format developed specifically for the library. The cuneiform characters were rendered with exceptional clarity, the layout uniform and organized. At the end of each tablet, the scribe would add a colophon, a kind of ownership statement and catalog information. The simplest colophons might read simply, Palace of Ashurbanipal, King of the Universe, King of Assyria, but often they provided much more detail. These longer colophons are treasures for modern scholars, recording that the text was copied carefully from an original tablet, specifying which earlier version served as the source, noting that the copy was reviewed and checked for accuracy. Some colophons contain warnings against anyone who might steal or damage the tablet, invoking divine curses on those who would disrespect the king's library. The seriousness with which these scribes approached their work echoes across the centuries, a reminder that the preservation of knowledge has always been recognized as a sacred duty. The physical organization of the library reflected careful thought. Tablets were shelved or placed in wall niches according to subject matter. Text series that spanned multiple tablets were kept together, numbered and catalogued so they could be retrieved in proper sequence. Alongside the clay tablets were writing boards, wooden or ivory panels covered with wax, into which cuneiform could be incised, used perhaps for texts requiring frequent consultation or revision. Walk slowly through this repository of ancient wisdom. Here are tablets containing the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic describing how the god Marduk defeated the chaos monster Tiamat and formed the world from her corpse. There are copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the profound meditation on mortality and friendship that tells of the king of Uruk and his wild companion Enkidu, their adventures together, and Gilgamesh's ultimately futile quest for immortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Akkadian and existing in multiple versions, represents one of humanity's earliest literary achievements. Its standard version spans 12 tablets, telling a story that resonated across cultures and centuries. In Tablet 11, the narrative includes a great flood account remarkably similar to the later biblical story of Noah. A survivor builds a boat, preserves animal life, and sends out birds to determine when the waters have receded. This similarity was not coincidence or borrowing in the direction typically assumed, but rather evidence of a common Near Eastern tradition from which both Mesopotamian and Hebrew cultures drew. The library's astronomical texts represent centuries of careful observation. Mesopotamian scholars tracked the movements of planets, identified constellations, predicted eclipses, and developed sophisticated mathematical models of celestial mechanics. These were not purely academic exercises, but practical tools, for in Mesopotamian thought, the heavens directly influenced earthly affairs. Reading the sky was reading the intentions of the gods, and accurate prediction of celestial phenomena was crucial for timing religious festivals, agricultural activities, and royal decisions. Medical texts in the library blend what we would recognize as empirical observation with supernatural interpretation. Symptoms are described with clinical precision: fevers, skin lesions, digestive disorders, headaches, but the causes are often attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment. Treatments combine herbal remedies, surgical procedures, and magical incantations. A patient might receive both a poultice made from specific plants and an elaborate ritual designed to expel the demon causing the illness. To Mesopotamian medical practitioners, these approaches were not contradictory, but complementary, different tools for addressing complex problems. The library also preserved more practical knowledge. Administrative texts detailed the complex bureaucracy of the Assyrian Empire. Mathematical texts demonstrated sophisticated techniques for calculating areas, volumes, and compound interest. Lexical lists, essentially ancient dictionaries, provided translations between Sumerian and Akkadian, and compiled specialized vocabularies for various professions and fields of knowledge. These lexical texts were essential tools for scribal education, since apprentice scribes needed to master not just one language, but multiple languages and writing systems. Consider the scribes themselves, the men whose labor created and maintained this extraordinary collection. In Mesopotamian society, literacy conferred tremendous status. While the vast majority of the population could neither read nor write, scribes formed a privileged class with access to knowledge, administrative positions, and relatively comfortable lives spent indoors rather than laboring in fields or workshops. Becoming a scribe required years of intensive training in the Eduba, the House of Tablets, the scribal schools attached to temples and palaces. Students began their education as children, learning first to fashion their own clay tablets and styluses. They practiced making the basic wedge shapes, repeated them endlessly until the motions became automatic. Then they began the long process of memorizing the hundreds of cuneiform signs, each representing either a word, a syllable, or a sound. Cuneiform script was dauntingly complex. The student scribe needed to master approximately 600 different signs in their basic forms, plus variants and combinations. A single sign might have multiple pronunciations and meanings depending on context. The script had evolved over millennia, accumulating layers of complexity as it was adapted from Sumerian to Akkadian and other languages. Reading cuneiform required not just mechanical decoding, but deep cultural and linguistic knowledge. Beyond the mechanics of writing, scribal students studied mathematics, learning calculation systems based on sexagesimal base 60 arithmetic that would later influence how we divide hours into minutes and minutes into seconds. They studied literature, memorizing and copying the great works of Mesopotamian tradition. They learned the scribal formulas for different types of documents, legal contracts, administrative records, royal inscriptions, letters. The education was comprehensive, designed to produce not mere copyists, but educated administrators capable of managing complex bureaucratic functions. The prestige of literacy in ancient Mesopotamia cannot be overstated. In a world where most information was transmitted orally and most people's knowledge was limited to their immediate experience, the ability to read and write opened vast horizons. A scribe could access the accumulated wisdom of generations. He could communicate across great distances and preserve thoughts beyond the span of a single life. He could serve kings and gods, recording their deeds and wishes for eternity. This is why Ashurbanipal himself took such pride in his literacy. Royal inscriptions record his boast that he could read the beautiful clay tablets from Sumer and the obscure Akkadian, which is hard to master. For a king to claim such abilities was unusual, a statement that Ashurbanipal valued intellectual achievement alongside military conquest. Yet even as the library grew, reaching its magnificent culmination in the 7th century BCE, the civilization that created it was approaching its end. The Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Near East through military might and administrative efficiency, faced growing threats. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes besieged Nineveh. The great capital fell after a brutal assault, its palaces and temples burned, its population killed or enslaved, its wealth plundered. The library did not survive intact. Fire swept through the palace complex, and while clay tablets can survive fire, indeed the heat often bakes them harder, preserving them better than sun-dried tablets, the organization was destroyed. Shelves collapsed, tablets fell and shattered. The carefully maintained catalogue was lost. Rooms were buried under debris as roofs caved in and walls crumbled. The accumulated knowledge of millennia lay forgotten beneath the ruins of Nineveh, waiting for centuries to be rediscovered. More than 2,000 years passed. The site of Nineveh was known, but its significance was forgotten. Local inhabitants might occasionally find fragments of inscribed clay when digging foundations or ploughing fields, but these curiosities had no meaning to people who could no longer read cuneiform. The script itself had died out by the early centuries of the Common Era, replaced by alphabetic writing systems that were simpler to learn and use. In the mid-19th century, European explorers and archaeologists began excavating ancient Mesopotamian sites. British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard began work at Nineveh in the late 1840s, focusing initially on the palace of Sennacherib. There, his assistant Hormuzd Rassam made the first discoveries of inscribed tablets in 1849 and 1850. The excavations continued through multiple seasons, led by Layard, Rassam, and later by others. The tablets emerged from the earth in astonishing numbers, tens of thousands of fragments, some intact, most broken, all covered in the mysterious wedge-shaped script that no living person could yet read. The tablets were packed carefully and shipped to the British Museum in London, where they joined other artifacts being assembled to represent the ancient civilizations of the Near East. Decipherment of cuneiform had begun earlier in the 19th century, building on work done with the trilingual inscriptions at Behistun in Persia. By the 1850s, scholars could read basic Akkadian cuneiform, though mastery remained limited to a small number of specialists. As tablets from Ashurbanipal's library arrived at the British Museum, the painstaking work of translation began. In 1872, a self-taught British Assyriologist named George Smith made a discovery that would capture the public imagination. Working through tablets from Nineveh, he translated the flood narrative from the Epic of Gilgamesh and recognized its striking similarity to the biblical flood story. Smith's announcement created a sensation. Here was evidence that the Bible's narratives were part of a broader ancient Near Eastern tradition, that stories long assumed to be unique to Hebrew scripture existed in earlier Mesopotamian versions. The Epic of Gilgamesh became the most famous text from Ashurbanipal's library, but it was merely one among thousands. As scholars continued the work of translation and interpretation over the following decades and centuries, the library yielded its secrets gradually. Medical knowledge, astronomical observations, religious practices, historical events, literary traditions, all emerged from the clay, allowing modern scholars to reconstruct ancient Mesopotamian civilization in previously impossible detail. RACC Museum.UPenn+1. Even now, the work continues. As of recent years, international collaborative projects work to catalogue completely the tablets from Ashurbanipal's library, to reconstruct broken pieces, to translate remaining untranslated texts. The task is enormous. Many tablets exist only as fragments. The same text might be represented by multiple partial copies that must be compared and combined to reconstruct the complete work. Specialized knowledge is required even to determine what category a particular text belongs to. Lie back and contemplate what these tablets represent. Each one is the product of immense labor, clay prepared, stylus fashioned, characters carefully impressed, text checked and catalogued. Behind each text lies years of scribal training, institutional support, cultural values that prioritized the preservation of knowledge. Behind the library itself stands a king who believed that assembling the world's wisdom was as important as conquering its cities. The survival of this knowledge through fire and time seems almost miraculous. The destruction of Nineveh inadvertently preserved the tablets by baking them harder. The dry climate of Iraq prevented the deterioration that would have claimed tablets in wetter environments. The location under palace ruins protected them from being robbed or reused. And finally, 19th century archaeology emerged at precisely the right moment to recognize their value and preserve them for study. Consider what would have been lost if any link in this chain had broken. Without Ashurbanipal's library, our knowledge of ancient Mesopotamian literature would be fragmentary at best. The Epic of Gilgamesh might have survived in later references, but not as a complete narrative. Medical and astronomical knowledge would be represented by scattered references rather than systematic treatises. The texture and detail of Mesopotamian religious and cultural life would remain obscure. The library reminds us that civilization is built not just through political and military power, but through the accumulation and transmission of knowledge. Kings rise and fall, empires expand and contract, but the written word preserves thought across centuries and millennia. The scribes who copied tablets for Ashurbanipal's library could not have imagined that their work would survive for over 2,500 years, that people in lands they never knew existed would study their careful script and seek to understand their world. Let your mind rest in this space between past and present, between the living library and its rediscovery, between the ancient scribes pressing stylus to clay and modern scholars translating their words. The library of Ashurbanipal bridges these vast distances, connecting us to people who lived before the alphabet was invented, before iron fully replaced bronze, before the great religions of Christianity and Islam emerged, yet who shared fundamental human concerns: the search for immortality, the fear of death, the need to understand the cosmos, the desire to preserve knowledge for future generations. The tablets wait in museum collections now, no longer in the palace at Nineveh, but scattered across institutions worldwide, primarily the British Museum. Scholars continue to study them, to discover new meanings in familiar texts, to piece together fragments into coherent wholes. The library that Ashurbanipal built continues to reveal ancient Mesopotamia's intellectual riches, a gift from a vanished civilization to all who seek to understand the human past. Sleep now with the image of those countless tablets, each one a repository of ancient thought, each one a connection to people who lived and died millennia ago, yet left their words behind, preserved in clay, waiting patiently through the centuries to speak again. From quiet libraries and the patient accumulation of knowledge, we return now to the realm of grandeur and imperial display. Move forward slightly in time to the 6th century BCE, to witness Babylon at the absolute zenith of its magnificence under King Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from 604 to 562 BCE. This is Babylon before its fall to Cyrus, Babylon as the wonder of the ancient world. Babylon as it appeared to visitors who could scarcely believe that human hands had created such marvels. Imagine yourself approaching the city from a distance. The landscape of southern Mesopotamia stretches flat in all directions, the monotony broken only by irrigation canals, scattered groves of date palms, and the occasional village of mud brick dwellings. Then, on the horizon, something extraordinary emerges. Walls so massive they seem less like human construction than geological features, rising from the earth as if the gods themselves had commanded stone to take this form. These are the walls of Babylon, and they define what contemporaries meant by impregnability. The defensive system actually consists of multiple concentric walls, creating layers of protection that would require an attacker to breach not once, but repeatedly. The outer wall, called the Imgur Enlil, stretches for miles around the city's perimeter. Behind it runs a second wall, the Nimiti Enlil. Between these two massive barriers lies a space wide enough that, according to some ancient accounts, a chariot drawn by 4 horses could turn around comfortably. The walls themselves rise to heights that contemporary observers found almost unbelievable. Ancient sources vary in their specifics, with some claiming heights of 300 feet or more, though modern archaeology suggests more modest, but still impressive dimensions of perhaps 40 to 50 feet for the main defensive walls. What is certain is that these fortifications represented the most advanced military architecture of their age, the product of generations of accumulated engineering knowledge applied with unlimited resources and labor. You approach the northern entrance to the inner city, following the road that countless traders, pilgrims, diplomats, and soldiers have traveled before you. The path leads to the most magnificent of Babylon's gates, the Ishtar Gate, dedicated to the goddess of love and war, constructed around 575 BCE during Nebuchadnezzar's extensive building program. Even from a distance, the gate's brilliance is striking. Unlike the mud brick construction typical of most Mesopotamian architecture, the Ishtar Gate is faced entirely with glazed bricks in vivid blues, whites, and golds. As you draw closer, the decorative program becomes clear. Alternating rows of bulls and dragons march across the gate's surface in bas-relief, their forms created from molded bricks covered in colored glaze that has been fired to a hard, glossy finish. The bulls represent Adad, the storm god, shown in profile with powerful shoulders and curved horns. The dragons, called Mushushu in Akkadian, are the sacred animals of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity. These are strange composite creatures, with serpentine necks, scaled bodies, the front legs of a lion and the rear legs of an eagle. They stride across the gate's surface with a kind of elegant ferocity, mythological guardians protecting the entrance to the sacred city. The Ishtar Gate was actually a double structure, with gates in both the outer and inner walls, creating a kind of ceremonial chamber between the two defensive barriers. The gate stood more than 38 feet high, towering over anyone who passed beneath it, a physical manifestation of Babylonian power and piety. Beyond the gate stretches the processional way, the broad avenue that connected the Ishtar Gate to the temple district in the city's heart. This was no ordinary street, but a ceremonial route used for religious festivals, particularly the Great New Year celebration, when statues of the gods were paraded through the city. The walls lining the processional way were decorated with similar glazed brick reliefs, though here the predominant image was lions. 120 of them, marching in procession along both sides of the street, representing the goddess Ishtar herself. Walk slowly down this magnificent avenue. Your feet tread on stones that have been carefully cut and fitted, creating a smooth surface suitable for the sacred palanquins carrying divine images. The walls rise on either side, their glazed surfaces catching and reflecting sunlight in brilliant flashes of color. The lions seem almost alive, frozen in mid-stride, eternal guardians of the sacred way. The scale of Nebuchadnezzar's building program is difficult to comprehend. He inherited a city that was already ancient and important, but he transformed it into something unprecedented. His inscriptions, found throughout Babylon, record his construction activities with pride. Temples rebuilt, walls reinforced, palaces constructed, canals dug, the entire urban landscape remade according to a grand vision. The king's motivation was partly practical. Strong walls protected the empire's capital, but also deeply religious. In Mesopotamian thought, the king served as the intermediary between gods and humans, responsible for maintaining the cosmic order through proper ritual and by creating magnificent dwellings for the deities. Building temples was not vanity, but sacred duty, and Nebuchadnezzar fulfilled this duty with unprecedented lavishness. As you proceed along the processional way, the city's central temple complex comes into view. At its heart stands Esagila, the great temple of Marduk, a sprawling complex of courtyards, sanctuaries, and administrative buildings. And rising beside it, dominating the skyline of Babylon, is the Etemenanki, the ziggurat whose very name means Temple of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. This is the structure that would later inspire the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, though its purpose was not arrogant human ambition, but religious devotion. The ziggurat, originally built in earlier centuries but extensively restored and enlarged by Nebuchadnezzar, was a stepped pyramid designed to connect earth and heaven, providing a high place where the gods might descend to meet with their human servants. The Etemenanki rose in 7 massive terraces, each one smaller than the one below, creating the characteristic stepped profile of Mesopotamian ziggurats. The base measured approximately 300 feet on each side, and the structure climbed to a similar height, making it one of the tallest buildings in the ancient world. At the summit stood a small temple, richly appointed, where priests conducted rituals and where Marduk himself was believed to reside during certain festivals. The construction of the Etemenanki required resources on an almost incomprehensible scale. Calculations suggest that at least 17 million bricks were needed for its completion. The restoration work, begun under earlier kings and completed by Nebuchadnezzar, took 43 years of continuous labor involving thousands of workers, skilled artisans, laborers, engineers, and administrators, all coordinating their efforts toward this single monumental goal. Imagine the city during the New Year festival, the Akitu, when all these architectural marvels served their intended purpose. The festival lasted 11 days and involved elaborate rituals that symbolically renewed the cosmic order for another year. The statue of Marduk would be carried in solemn procession from the Esagila temple through the Ishtar gate and out to the Akitu house beyond the city walls, then back again in triumph. The streets would be filled with celebrants, the air thick with incense and the sounds of ritual music. Priests in ceremonial garments would chant ancient hymns in Sumerian and Akkadian. The king himself would participate, ritually humbled before Marduk, having his royal regalia temporarily removed as a reminder that his authority derived from divine favor, not personal right. Then, the regalia restored, he would lead the procession celebrating Marduk's victory over chaos, a mythological triumph reenacted annually to ensure continued order and prosperity. Standing in the streets during such a festival, surrounded by the magnificent architecture that Nebuchadnezzar had created, Witnessing the elaborate rituals that connected Babylon to its ancient traditions, you would understand why this city was considered the center of the civilized world. Everything, the massive walls, the glazed brick gates, the towering ziggurat, the processional way, everything worked together to create an overwhelming impression of power, piety, and permanence. Yet there is one element of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon that remains mysterious, perhaps the most famous and the most elusive: the Hanging Gardens, counted by later Greek writers among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Ancient descriptions of the gardens are detailed and evocative. They speak of an artificial mountain of vegetation rising in terraces, with trees, shrubs, and flowers planted at different levels. Water was supposedly raised from the Euphrates through an elaborate mechanical system, creating lush greenery in the midst of Babylon's hot, dry climate. The effect would have been magical. A green paradise in a landscape of brown earth and brick, a demonstration of human ingenuity, triumphing over natural limitations. According to tradition, Nebuchadnezzar built the gardens for his wife Amytis, a Median princess who missed the mountains and forests of her homeland. The gardens were meant to recreate that verdant landscape, to provide comfort and beauty in the flat Mesopotamian plain. Yet here, we encounter a puzzle that troubles modern scholars. There is no definitive archaeological evidence for the Hanging Gardens at Babylon. No ruins have been identified that clearly correspond to ancient descriptions. More significantly, Nebuchadnezzar's own extensive inscriptions, which detail his building projects with pride, never mention any gardens. Writers like Herodotus, who described Babylon at length and who loved to report marvels, make no reference to hanging gardens. This silence has led some scholars to propose that the Hanging Gardens are mythical, a story that grew through retelling but had no basis in reality. Others suggest the gardens existed but were located not in Babylon but in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, where King Sennacherib described building elaborate gardens with sophisticated irrigation systems in the late 8th century BCE. Perhaps later writers conflated Nineveh and Babylon, attributing Assyrian engineering to the more famous Neo-Babylonian city. The mystery remains unresolved, adding a layer of uncertainty to our image of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. Whether the gardens existed or not, the fact that such a wonder seemed plausible to ancient writers tells us something important. Babylon's reputation for magnificence was so great that any marvel seemed possible within its walls. Rest your mind on the undisputed glories that did exist. The palace complex where Nebuchadnezzar resided was itself a wonder, with its throne room featuring walls decorated with glazed brick panels showing elaborate geometric and floral patterns. The rooms were vast, the ceilings supported by massive cedar beams imported at great expense from Lebanon. Courtyards featured gardens, not hanging gardens perhaps, but still impressive displays of cultivation in a harsh environment. The city's infrastructure was equally impressive, though less visually dramatic. An elaborate system of canals brought water from the Euphrates to different quarters of the city, providing both drinking water and irrigation for gardens and agriculture within the walls. Streets were laid out in a regular grid pattern, unusual for ancient cities, suggesting centralized urban planning. There were bridges spanning the Euphrates, connecting the city's eastern and western halves. The population of Babylon at its height may have reached 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. This diverse population included native Babylonians, of course, but also peoples from throughout the empire. Judeans brought as captives after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. Phoenician merchants, Egyptian craftsmen, and representatives of countless other subject peoples who found themselves in this cosmopolitan center. Walk through the residential quarters away from the monumental center. Here, the architecture is more modest, the familiar mud brick houses of ordinary Mesopotamians, though even here the density and organization speak to sophisticated urban planning. Markets bustled with activity, merchants offering goods from across the known world, precious stones from India, timber from Lebanon, metals from Anatolia, textiles dyed with expensive Phoenician purple, spices, incense, slaves, and countless other commodities. The scribal schools train new generations in cuneiform literacy. The temples, beyond their religious functions, served as economic centers, managing vast agricultural estates, employing thousands, and functioning almost as corporations in their complexity. The royal administration coordinated tax collection, military recruitment, public works, and diplomatic relations across an empire stretching from Egypt to the Persian Gulf. Yet even as Babylon reached this pinnacle, forces were gathering that would end its independence. We have already witnessed, earlier in our journey, how Cyrus the Great would enter this magnificent city in 539 BCE, how the gates would open without a fight, how Persian rule would replace Neo-Babylonian sovereignty. Nebuchadnezzar, who made Babylon glorious, died in 562 BCE, and the dynasty he served quickly weakened under less capable successors. Stand one last time in the processional way, looking up at the Ishtar Gate with its glazed brick animals, toward the Etemenanki rising against the sky. Feel the weight of all that human ambition created here, the millions of bricks shaped and fired, the years of labor, the resources of an empire dedicated to creating something magnificent, something that would awe visitors and honor the gods. This splendor was not eternal, though it must have seemed so to those who built it. The walls that appeared impregnable would be breached by time and conquest. The glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate would eventually be excavated by German archaeologists in the early 20th century and transported to Berlin, where a reconstruction of the gate now stands in the Pergamon Museum, far from the Iraqi soil where it originally rose. The Etemenanki, that mighty ziggurat, was damaged by Xerxes and finally destroyed by Alexander the Great, who planned to rebuild it even grander than before, but died before the work could begin. Today, only a depression in the ground marks where it once stood, its millions of bricks robbed away over centuries for other construction projects. Yet something of Babylon's glory persists in the archaeological record that allows us to reconstruct its layout and architecture, in the inscriptions that record Nebuchadnezzar's pride in his accomplishments, in the biblical accounts that, however hostile to Babylon theologically, cannot help but convey awe at its magnificence, and in the continued fascination that the name Babylon evokes, symbolizing imperial grandeur, cultural sophistication, and the heights of human architectural ambition. Let the image of the city fade slowly, the glazed bricks losing their brilliance, the massive walls dissolving back into the earth from which they came, the processional way gradually buried under accumulated sediment and debris. Cities, like empires, have their seasons. They rise, flourish, and eventually fall, their physical remains offering future generations hints of what once was. The people who walked Babylon's streets, who worshipped in its temples, who conducted business in its markets, who defended its walls, they are long gone, their individual lives forgotten, except for those few whose names appear in royal inscriptions or administrative documents. Yet in creating this magnificent city, they left something that transcends individual mortality, a testament to human capacity for organization, engineering, artistic expression, and the transformation of landscape through collective effort. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon represents a pinnacle of ancient Near Eastern urban civilization. It was built on millennia of accumulated knowledge. Irrigation techniques developed by Sumerian farmers, writing systems created by early scribes, architectural principles refined through countless generations, religious traditions stretching back to the beginning of recorded history. All of this came together in one place, at one moment, creating something unprecedented in scale and magnificence. And now, having witnessed this splendor, having walked its streets and stood before its monuments, you can rest in the knowledge that such glory existed, however briefly, however impermanently. The contrast between ancient magnificence and modern comfort, between the monumental public architecture of Babylon and the private space where you now lie, serves to highlight both the changes that separate us from the ancient world and the continuities that connect us to it. Sleep now, as Babylon itself sleeps, buried under Iraqi soil, remembered in texts and reconstructions, living on in imagination and scholarship. A dream of stone and glazed brick, of gods and kings, of ordinary people living extraordinary collective achievements. The night settles over the land between the rivers, as it has for countless millennia, indifferent to human glory and human failure, patient and eternal. The morning begins, as it always does, with the cold pressing against your skin like a living thing. You wake in darkness, wrapped in a rough woolen blanket, woven from llama fiber, the kind of textile that offers some warmth, but never quite enough at these altitudes. Outside your small stone dwelling, the stars are still visible, scattered across the black sky like the embers of a distant fire. In a few hours, the sun will rise over the ridgeline to the east, and the air will warm slightly, but for now, the world is silent, brittle, and achingly cold. You know what today will bring because the messenger arrived yesterday evening, carrying with him the quipu that records the labor obligations of your Ailu, your kin group, your community. The knots on the cords have been carefully interpreted by the quipu kamayok, the record keeper who tracks every household, every field, every able-bodied man. And now, your name has come up. You are required to give 3 months of your life this year to the state, to participate in the mitar, the rotational labor service that is both the foundation of the empire's power and the weight that every commoner must bear. This is not slavery, the administrators will tell you. This is reciprocity, the principle of Aini. You give your labor, and in return, the state provides roads, storehouses filled with reserves for times of famine, protection from enemies, and order. But as you pull on your simple tunic and tie the woven cord around your waist, you feel the weight of obligation more than the comfort of reciprocity. You are 15 years old, and this is the first year you are required to serve, though you have watched your father and older brothers depart for the mitar many times before. You know what awaits you: the exhaustion, the danger, the separation from everything familiar. By mid-morning, you join a group of 30 other young men from surrounding villages, all of you assembled in the central plaza of the regional administrative center. The curator stands before you, a man of authority draped in finely woven cloth, his earlobes stretched by the heavy golden plugs that mark his rank. He speaks in Quechua, his voice calm and measured, explaining that you will be traveling north for 8 days, to the site of a new royal estate being constructed high in the mountains. The work, he says, will involve quarrying and transporting stone, shaping blocks with bronze chisels and river stones, and fitting them together with such precision that no mortar will be needed. You will be fed, he assures you, with rations from the state storehouses, potatoes, quinoa, dried llama meat, and occasionally a portion of maize beer, chicha, to ease the weariness. You shoulder the small bundle you were allowed to bring, an extra tunic, a pair of woven sandals, a wooden bowl for eating, and a sling for hunting small birds if the opportunity arises. Then you begin walking. The road stretches ahead, paved with flat stones and bordered by low walls, a testament to the labor of those who came before you. You walk in a line with the others, your feet finding the rhythm of the march, your breath coming short and shallow in the thin mountain air. At this altitude, well over 10,000 feet above the distant sea, every exertion demands more effort than it would in the lowlands. Your chest tightens, your head begins to ache, a dull, persistent throb that will not fully fade until your body adjusts, if it ever does. The landscape around you is breathtaking in its harshness. Steep valleys plunge away on either side of the road, their slopes covered in terraced fields where potatoes and oak grow in neat rows. Above, the peaks rise like the teeth of some ancient beast, their summits capped with snow that glows white in the sunlight. Condors circle lazily in the sky, their wings spread wide, riding the thermals that rise from the warming earth below. You pass through villages where children pause in their play to watch you go by, where women grinding maize on stone metates glance up briefly before returning to their work. You pass llama herds grazing on the sparse highland grasses, their handlers calling out greetings as you walk past. On the third day of the journey, you begin to climb in earnest. The road switchbacks up the side of a mountain, gaining altitude with every step. Your legs burn, your lungs ache. You pause frequently to catch your breath, bending over with your hands on your knees, sucking in air that seems to offer no nourishment. Some of the younger men, those unaccustomed to this elevation, begin to suffer more acutely: nausea, dizziness, a pounding headache that makes it difficult to focus. The overseers, experienced men who have made this journey many times, distribute coca leaves, instructing you to tuck a wad of them into your cheek and chew slowly. The bitter juice numbs your mouth and brings a faint sense of relief, a slight easing of the fatigue, though it does not banish the discomfort entirely. By the time you reach the construction site, you are filthy, exhausted, and disoriented. The camp sprawls across a high saddle between two peaks, a temporary settlement of stone shelters, cooking fires, and storage huts. Hundreds of men are already here, some hauling massive blocks of granite on wooden rollers, others shaping stones with patient, methodical blows of their hammers, still others lashing together the roof timbers of a new hall. The noise is constant, the clatter of stone on stone, the shouts of foremen directing the work, the rhythmic grunting of men straining under impossible weights. You are assigned to a work crew tasked with quarrying stone from a nearby outcrop. The work begins before dawn and continues until the light fails. You learn quickly that precision is valued above speed. Each block must be shaped to fit perfectly with its neighbors, the surfaces ground smooth with sand and water until they lock together without gap or wobble. This is how the Inca build, not with mortar, but with patience and skill, creating walls that will stand for centuries. Your hands blister and then harden. Your back becomes a map of aches. You develop a cough from the dust that hangs in the air, a fine grit that coats your lungs and makes every breath rasp. The rations, as promised, arrive regularly from the state storehouses. Twice a day, you line up with your wooden bowl to receive a portion of boiled potatoes, sometimes accompanied by a thin stew of quinoa and dried meat. The food is plain, filling, but not generous, carefully calculated to sustain you without excess. On festival days, when the work is paused to honor the gods, you receive a small measure of chicha, the fermented maize beer that brings a brief warmth to your belly and a loosening of the tension in your shoulders. You drink it quickly, savoring the slight dizziness it brings, the temporary forgetting of the soreness in your limbs. The nights are the hardest. You sleep in a communal shelter, a long stone building with a thatched roof, crowded together with 40 other men. The cold seeps through the walls, and despite the body heat of so many people pressed close, you wake shivering, your breath visible in the darkness. You think of home, of your mother's cooking fire, of your younger siblings, of the small plot of land your family tends. You wonder if they are managing without your labor, if your father is working extra hours to make up for your absence. The system is designed to ensure that your family can survive while you are gone. The mitter is rotational after all, so that not every man is taken at once, but the burden is still real, still felt. There are moments of danger too. One morning, A block of stone slips from its rollers as it is being moved, crushing the foot of a man standing too close. He screams, a sound that cuts through the ambient noise, and the work halts briefly while he is carried away. You do not see him again, and you do not ask what became of him. Another day, a section of scaffolding collapses, sending two men tumbling to the ground. One rises, shaken but unharmed. The other does not move. His body is wrapped in cloth and carried down the mountain, back to his village, where his family will mourn. These losses are noted, recorded perhaps on a quipu somewhere, but they do not stop the work. The state requires this building to be completed, and so the labor continues, relentless and unyielding. The mita is not limited to construction. Some men are sent to work in the silver mines, descending into tunnels carved deep into the mountainside, where the air is thick with dust and the walls gleam faintly with veins of ore. Others are assigned to agricultural projects, expanding the terraced fields that allow maize and potatoes to be grown on impossibly steep slopes. Still, others maintain the roads, clearing rock slides, repairing bridges woven from grass rope that sway precariously over roaring rivers. The empire runs on this labor, on the collective effort of millions of ordinary men who give their time, their strength, and sometimes their lives to the projects that bind Tawantinsuyu together. The administrative system that tracks all of this is extraordinarily sophisticated. Every village, every household, every individual is recorded on quipus, those knotted cords that encode information in a language of knots, colors, and positions. The quipu kamayoks can tell you exactly how many days of labor you owe, how many you have completed, and how many remain. They know the population of every province, the contents of every storehouse, the number of llamas in every herd. This is how the state ensures that the burden is shared, that no single community is overwhelmed, and that the work gets done. But for you, standing in the cold dawn with your hands wrapped around a stone hammer, the system feels less like reciprocity and more like an immovable force, a weight pressing down on your shoulders that you cannot escape. There is a quiet understanding among the laborers that resistance is futile. The empire is too vast, too organized, too powerful. Those who refuse their mita obligations face punishment, beatings, confiscation of property, exile to distant regions. Those who fulfill their duty without complaint may be rewarded with a slightly larger ration, a word of praise from an overseer, or the knowledge that they have done what was expected of them. Most men simply endure. They count the days until their service is complete, until they can return home, until the cycle begins again the following year. Wikipedia +1. After 3 months, when your term is finally finished, you are given a small bundle of dried food for the journey home and a new tunic woven by the Akla, the chosen women who produce textiles for the state. You walk back down the mountain with a group of other men whose service has ended, your legs stronger than they were, your hands calloused, your body thinner but harder. The altitude no longer troubles you as it once did, though the ache in your chest remains, a reminder of the thin air and the relentless exertion. You reach your village after 8 days of walking, and your family greets you with quiet relief. Your mother has saved a portion of stew for you. Your father nods approvingly. Your younger siblings look at you with something that might be respect or perhaps pity. You are home, but you know this is only temporary. Next year, or perhaps the year after, the quipu kamayok will come again, and your name will appear on the cords once more. The mita is a cycle that does not end, a rhythm as constant as the seasons, as inevitable as the rising of the sun over the mountains. You will build roads, terraces, temples, bridges. You will haul stones, weave ropes, dig tunnels. You will give your labor to the state year after year until you reach the age of 50 and are finally released from the obligation, or until your body gives out. or until the empire itself crumbles, though such a thing seems impossible now in this moment as you sit by your family's fire and let the warmth seep into your bones. The empire feels eternal, the mountains feel eternal, the Mitta feels eternal, but nothing in the end lasts forever. Segment 2. The capture of Atahualpa at Cajamarca, 1532. The year is 1532, and the Inca Empire, for all its vastness and all its strength, is fracturing from within. The great Sapa Inca Huayna Capac has died, and in his death he has left behind not clarity, but chaos. Two of his sons, Huascar, the legitimate heir based in Cusco, and Atahualpa, a favored son born of a different mother and commanding armies in the north, now struggle for control of Tawantinsuyu. What began as a dispute over succession has become a full civil war, a conflict that has torn the empire apart and left thousands dead on battlefields stretching from Quito to Cusco. Imagine yourself not as a laborer now, but as a witness to history, standing at a distance as these events unfold. You watch as armies clash, as cities burn, as brothers turn against brothers in a struggle for power that will reshape the world. Atahualpa, backed by seasoned generals and over 100,000 battle-hardened troops, has won victory after victory. At Mulihambato, at Chimborazo, at Quipaipan, his forces have crushed Huascar's armies with brutal efficiency. In the final confrontation, just a few miles west of Cusco, Huascar himself was captured, bound, and imprisoned. Atahualpa now stands as the undisputed ruler of the empire, though his throne is built on the bodies of his countrymen and the ashes of his brother's ambitions. In the autumn of 1532, Atahualpa is camped outside the city of Cajamarca, a settlement nestled in a high valley in the northern Andes. He has come here to rest, to recuperate in the hot springs that bubble up from the earth, and to consolidate his power after years of warfare. His army, some 40,000 strong, surrounds the city, a vast encampment of soldiers, servants, and retainers. The emperor himself is carried on a golden litter, dressed in fine cloth woven from the wool of vicuñas, adorned with gold and feathers that shimmer in the sunlight. He is victorious, he is powerful, he is, by all accounts, invincible. And then the strangers arrive. They are a small group, fewer than 200 men, led by a Spanish adventurer named Francisco Pizarro. They have come from the coast, traveling inland through difficult terrain, guided by an Inca noble sent by Atahualpa himself to assess these curious foreigners. The noble has spent 2 days in the Spanish camp, observing their weapons, their horses, their strange metal armor. He reports back to Atahualpa that these men pose no threat. They are too few, too isolated, too far from any source of reinforcement. Atahualpa, confident in the size and strength of his army, sends word inviting the Spaniards to Cajamarca. He expects to capture them, perhaps to add them to his collection of curiosities, or to learn more about these pale-skinned men who ride animals the Incas have never seen before. Pizarro and his men arrive in Cajamarca on November 15th, 1532. The town has been largely emptied of its 2,000 inhabitants, cleared to make way for the meeting between the emperor and the foreigners. The Spaniards take up positions in the plaza, a large open space surrounded by stone buildings. They set up their artillery, small cannons that can hurl iron balls across the square, and conceal their cavalry in the narrow streets that lead into the plaza. Pizarro knows that he is outnumbered by a staggering margin. His 168 men face an army of tens of thousands, but he also knows that surprise, speed, and violence can compensate for numbers, and he has gambled everything on a single audacious plan. The following day, November 16th, Atahualpa agrees to meet with Pizarro in the plaza. The emperor is carried on his litter, surrounded by thousands of attendants, nobles, and soldiers, all unarmed, all dressed in ceremonial finery. It is not a war council, it is a display of imperial majesty, a demonstration of power meant to awe and intimidate the foreigners. The procession enters the plaza slowly, the rhythmic chanting of the attendants echoing off the stone walls. Atahualpa sits high on his litter, serene and confident, his gaze sweeping over the empty plaza where the Spaniards wait hidden. A Spanish priest steps forward, carrying a Bible and a cross. Through an interpreter, he speaks to Atahualpa, urging him to accept Christianity, to acknowledge the authority of the Spanish King Charles V, and to submit to the will of God. The words are incomprehensible to Atahualpa, filtered through imperfect translation, wrapped in concepts utterly foreign to Inca belief. He asks to see the book the priest is holding. When it is handed to him, he examines it, flips through the pages, and then, finding nothing of interest, tosses it to the ground. This is the signal Pizarro has been waiting for. He gives the order, and the trap is sprung. The cannons fire, their roar splitting the air, sending iron balls tearing through the densely packed crowd. The cavalry charges from the side streets, their horses, animals the Incas have never encountered, creatures that seem like some fusion of man and beast, crashing into the terrified mass of attendants. The Spanish soldiers, armored in steel and wielding swords and pikes, press forward with ruthless efficiency. The Incas, unarmed and unprepared, are slaughtered by the thousands. They try to flee, but the plaza is enclosed, and the exits are narrow. Bodies pile upon bodies. The air fills with screams, with the acrid smell of gunpowder, with the metallic scent of spilled life. Atahualpa, still on his litter, is surrounded by his most loyal bodyguards, men who throw themselves in front of the Spanish blades to protect their emperor. They are cut down one by one, their hands severed as they reach out to hold the litter aloft, their bodies falling to the stones as the Spaniards press forward. Finally, Pizarro himself reaches Atahualpa, grabs him, and pulls him from the litter. The emperor is captured, dragged away from the carnage, held hostage by the foreigners he had so casually invited into his domain. The massacre lasts less than an hour. When it is over, approximately 7,000 Inca attendants lie dead in the plaza and the surrounding streets. Not a single Spanish soldier has been seriously injured. The disparity is staggering, incomprehensible, a demonstration of the devastating advantage that steel, horses, and gunpowder provide over cloth armor and ceremonial weapons. Atahualpa, the victorious emperor, the man who defeated his brother and claimed the throne of the largest empire in the Americas, is now a prisoner. In the days and weeks that follow, Atahualpa remains in captivity, confined to a room in Cajamarca, while Pizarro decides what to do with him. The emperor, desperate for his freedom, makes an extraordinary offer. He will fill the room in which he is held, once with gold and twice with silver, stacked as high as his outstretched hand can reach. The room is 22 feet long and 17 feet wide, and Atahualpa, a tall man, can reach his hand to over 8 feet. The sheer volume of treasure he is promising is staggering, an amount that would make every man in Pizarro's expedition wealthy beyond imagining. Pizarro agrees. Word is sent throughout the empire, and over the following months, llama trains laden with gold and silver begin to arrive in Cajamarca. Ornaments are stripped from temples, golden plates are pulled from palaces, silver vessels are melted down and reformed into bars. The Spanish, impatient and greedy, deliberately break many of the finely crafted objects to ensure that the room fills more slowly, to extract even more treasure from the empire. The pile grows, gold and silver accumulate in gleaming heaps, a ransom unprecedented in human history. By July 1533, Atahualpa has fulfilled his promise. The room has been filled as agreed, over 6,000 kilograms of gold and nearly 12,000 kilograms of silver, an amount worth nearly $500 million by modern standards. 20% is set aside for the Spanish king. The remainder is divided among the soldiers, with even the lowest ranking receiving 20 kilograms of gold and 40 kilograms of silver. Atahualpa waits, expecting his release, trusting that the foreigners will honor their word. But Pizarro does not keep his promise. He is afraid. Rumors have reached him that an Inca general, Rumiñahui, is approaching with an army. The Spanish, for all their success, are still vastly outnumbered, still deep in hostile territory, still vulnerable. As long as Atahualpa lives, he remains a rallying point for resistance, a symbol of Inca power that could unite the fractured empire against the invaders. And so, on July 26, 1533, after a mock trial in which Atahualpa is accused of treason, of plotting against the Spanish, and of murdering his brother Huáscar, he is sentenced to death. The execution is carried out that evening. Atahualpa is offered a choice: be burned alive as a pagan, or accept Christian baptism and be granted the mercy of strangulation. He chooses baptism, taking the Christian name Juan, and is then garroted, his life extinguished by a tightening cord around his neck. The last emperor of the independent Inca Empire dies a prisoner, far from Cusco, far from the throne he fought so hard to claim, betrayed by men he had underestimated and undone by the fractured state of the empire he had just unified. The consequences of that single afternoon in Cajamarca ripple outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water. With Atahualpa dead and Huáscar already executed on Atahualpa's orders during the Civil War, the Inca leadership is decapitated. The Spanish install puppet rulers, men they can control, while they consolidate their grip on the empire. The centralized administration that held Tawantinsuyu together, the quipu keepers, the road networks, the storehouses, the meter system, begins to fray and collapse. Resistance continues for decades, particularly in the remote fortress of Vilcabamba, but the empire, as a unified political entity, is finished. It is difficult, from the comfort of the present, to fully grasp the magnitude of what occurred at Cajamarca. An empire of 10 million people, stretching over 2,500 miles from modern-day Ecuador to Chile, was brought to its knees in a matter of hours by fewer than 200 men. The reasons are complex. The Civil War had weakened the empire. Diseases brought by the Spanish were already spreading through the population. The technological advantages of steel and gunpowder were overwhelming, but the proximate cause was the capture of a single man. Atahualpa's confidence, his underestimation of the foreigners, and the Spanish willingness to employ treachery and violence without hesitation combined to produce a catastrophe that changed the course of history. As you imagine yourself standing in the plaza in Cajamarca on that November afternoon, the sounds of the massacre fading into silence, the bodies of thousands lying still on the cold stones, you might feel a chill that has nothing to do with the mountain air. This is the moment when one world ends and another begins, when the rhythms of life that had governed the Andes for centuries, the mita, the terraced fields, the quipu records, the sun festivals, are interrupted by a force that will reshape everything. The empire built by the labor of millions, sustained by roads and storehouses, and the collective effort of communities stretching across mountains and valleys, is now in the hands of men who see it only as a source of wealth to be extracted and power to be claimed. Atahualpa's ransom room still stands in Cajamarca today, a small, unassuming structure with fine Inca stonework at its base. A red line marks the height to which the emperor promised to fill it with gold. Visitors can stand in that space and try to imagine the gleaming pile of treasure that once filled it, the desperation of the man who offered it, and the betrayal that followed. It is a quiet place now, a monument to a promise broken and an empire lost. And somewhere in the mountains, in the villages where the Mit-Ayos once gathered to fulfill their labor obligations, life continues, but it is a different life, governed by different rules, shaped by different powers. The stones they hauled still stand in the walls of Machu Picchu and Cusco, silent witnesses to the empire that was and the catastrophe that came. The terraces they built still cling to the hillsides, their edges softened by centuries of rain and wind. And the memory of Atahualpa, the emperor who almost unified his fractured empire, lingers in the collective consciousness, a reminder of how quickly the powerful can fall and how fragile even the mightiest civilizations can be. Let your mind shift now, away from the violence of Cajamarca, away from the collapse of empires, and towards something quieter, something more enigmatic. Imagine yourself in a small, dim room in Cusco, the capital of Tawantinsuyu, in the years before the Spanish arrival. The walls are made of perfectly fitted stone blocks, each one shaped to interlock with its neighbors without mortar, their surfaces cool to the touch. Sunlight filters through a narrow doorway, illuminating motes of dust that hang suspended in the still air. And there, seated on a low stool, his fingers moving with practiced precision, is a Quipucamayok, a keeper of the knots. Before him, spread across his lap and hanging from a wooden frame, is a quipu. It is a deceptively simple object, a thick primary cord, perhaps 3 feet long, from which dangle dozens of thinner pendant strings, each one dyed in a specific color: crimson, ochre, deep indigo, natural white. Along the length of these pendant cords, at carefully measured intervals, knots have been tied, some single, some looped multiple times, some shaped like the figure 8. To an untrained eye, it might look like nothing more than a decorative piece, a tangle of colored threads. But to the Quipucamayok, it is a language, a record, a repository of information as precise and as vital as any ledger inscribed on paper or carved into stone. The quipu is the Inca Empire's answer to writing, though whether it truly constitutes a form of writing remains one of the great mysteries of archaeology. What we know with certainty is that these knotted cords were used to record vast amounts of data: census figures, tribute obligations, inventories of storehouses, records of military personnel, accounts of agricultural production. The system is fundamentally decimal, based on powers of 10, with different types of knots representing different numerical values. A single knot, depending on its position along the cord, can represent 10, 100, 1,000, or 10,000. A long knot, in which the cord is wrapped around itself multiple times, represents the numbers 2 through 9, with the specific number indicated by the count of loops in the knot. And a figure 8 knot, placed near the end of a pendant cord, represents the number 1. Imagine the Quipucamayok working methodically through his task. He has been given a directive from the regional governor: compile a record of the maize harvest from 20 villages in the valley. He begins by selecting pendant cords of a specific color, yellow perhaps, to signify maize. Each cord will represent one village. As the reports arrive, carried by runners along the Inca road network, he ties the appropriate knots, encoding the quantities with precision. 3,000 bundles of maize from the first village, a single knot in the thousands position, no knots in the hundreds, no knots in the tens, no knots in the ones. 1,500 from the second village, a single knot for 1,000, a long knot with 5 loops for 500. The work is meticulous, requiring absolute accuracy, because these records will be sent to Cusco, to be stored in the central archives, and they will determine how much tribute each village owes, how much surplus exists in the storehouses, and how resources should be allocated in times of scarcity. But the quipu is not only a tool for accounting. Spanish chroniclers who witnessed the Inca Empire in its final years reported that quipus were also used to record histories, genealogies, poems, and even songs. One Spanish observer wrote that the Quipucamayoks could recite the deeds of past emperors, the details of battles, and the names of noble lineages, all by reading the patterns encoded in the knots. This suggests that the quipu may have functioned as a mnemonic device, a way of organizing and recalling narrative information, though whether the knots themselves encoded language in the way that alphabetic writing does, or merely served as prompts to trigger memorized oral traditions, remains deeply uncertain. The structure of a quipu can be extraordinarily complex. The largest known example has 586 pendant chords organized into 8 sections with up to 13 sub-levels of subsidiary chords branching off from the main pendants, holding over 15,000 discrete pieces of information. The color of each chord matters. The length matters. The spacing between knots matters. The direction in which a knot is tied, what modern researchers call the S or Z orientation, matters. Even the ply of the thread, whether it is spun clockwise or counterclockwise, may carry meaning. The quipu is not a linear text to be read from left to right or top to bottom. It is a three-dimensional object, tactile and spatial, requiring the reader to touch, to feel, to move through the chords in a specific sequence. The Quipucamayos were trained from childhood in this art. They were government officials, positioned at every level of the Inca bureaucracy, in villages, in provincial capitals, in Cusco itself. Larger towns might have 30 or more Quipucamayos, each responsible for a specific domain, one for population records, another for agricultural production, another for military inventories, another for tribute obligations. They were respected, essential, entrusted with the smooth functioning of the empire. When the Sapa Inca needed to know how many men were available for the mita, or how much gold had been extracted from the mines, or how many llamas were in the royal herds, it was the Quipucamayos who provided the answers, pulling the relevant quipus from their archives and reading the information encoded in the knots. The quipus traveled across the empire on the backs of Chasqui, relay runners who carried messages along the vast road network known as the Capac Nyan. These runners, young and exceptionally fit, would sprint from one way station to the next, covering distances of several miles, before handing their quipu off to the next runner in the chain. In this way, information could be transmitted from the coast to Cusco or from Quito to Lake Titicaca in a matter of days. A quipu reporting a military victory or the death of a regional governor or a famine in a distant province would move through the mountains at the pace of human feet, arriving at the capital where officials would decode its message and take appropriate action. And then the Spanish arrived and the quipus began to disappear. The conquistadors, for the most part, did not understand the quipus. They saw knotted strings, primitive devices used by a people without writing, and they dismissed them as curiosities or destroyed them outright. Spanish missionaries, intent on converting the indigenous population to Christianity, viewed quipus with suspicion, fearing that they might encode pagan beliefs or serve as tools for resistance. Many quipus were burned, deliberately destroyed as part of the campaign to erase indigenous culture and impose European systems of record-keeping. The Quipucamayos, those who could read the knots, were dispersed, converted, or killed. Their knowledge, passed down through generations, began to fade. Today, approximately 1,000 quipus survive, scattered in museums and private collections around the world. They are fragile objects, made of cotton or alpaca fiber, their colors faded by centuries of exposure to light and air. Scholars have been studying them for over a century, attempting to decode their meanings, to unlock the information they contain. Mathematical analysis has revealed the numerical system with confidence. We understand how the Inca encoded quantities, how they performed calculations, how they represented zero as the absence of knots in a particular position. But the narrative quipus, those that may have recorded stories, histories, or poetry, remain largely impenetrable. Recent efforts have employed computational techniques, applying algorithms similar to those used in machine translation to search for patterns in the surviving corpus of quipus. Researchers have catalogued the knots, the colors, the chord lengths, feeding this data into computer models in the hope of identifying recurring structures that might reveal a linguistic code. The question is tantalizing. Can a language lost to the violence of colonization be brought back to life through statistical analysis and machine learning? Can we recover the voices of the Quipucamayos, the administrators and historians who once recited the deeds of emperors and the genealogies of noble families by running their fingers over knotted cords? The challenge is immense. Unlike the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics, which was made possible by the Rosetta Stone, a single artifact that presented the same text in 3 different scripts, there is no equivalent key for the quipu. No Spanish chronicler thought to transcribe a quipu's contents alongside a written translation. No Quipucamayok left behind a manual explaining how the system worked. We are left with the objects themselves, silent and enigmatic, holding their secrets close. Imagine holding one of these quipus in your hands, the pendant cords slipping through your fingers, the knots catching gently against your skin. You feel the texture of the fiber, some cords smooth and tightly spun, others rougher, looser. You notice that certain cords are grouped together, tied to the primary cord in clusters, while others hang alone. You see that some knots are tied close to the primary cord, while others dangle near the free end of the pendant. You wonder, is this a record of a harvest, a census of a village, a poem commemorating a battle, a song about the creation of the world? The quipu offers no answers, only possibilities. There is something deeply moving about this uncertainty. The quipu represents a fundamentally different approach to information storage and communication, one that does not rely on visual symbols inscribed on a flat surface, but on knots tied in 3-dimensional space. It is tactile, spatial, kinetic, a writing system you experience with your hands as much as with your eyes. And now, severed from the cultural context that gave it meaning, it exists in a state of suspended potential, a language waiting to be spoken again. Some scholars argue that we may never fully decode the narrative quipus, that too much knowledge has been lost, that the connections between the knots and the stories they encoded were too dependent on oral traditions and cultural frameworks that no longer exist. Others remain optimistic, pointing to advances in computational analysis and the discovery of new quipus as reasons to hope that a breakthrough is possible. The debate continues, quiet and scholarly, unfolding in academic journals and research conferences, far removed from the cold Andean nights when Quipucamayos sat by firelight, their fingers moving over the chords, reciting the history of their people. As you sit in that dim room in Cusco, watching the Quipucamayok work, you realize that you are witnessing something remarkable, a civilization that built roads spanning thousands of miles, that moved massive stones with precision and patience, that organized the labor of millions, all without alphabetic writing. The quipu was sufficient. It met the empire's needs, encoding vast bureaucracies and intricate histories in a medium that was portable, durable, and flexible. And yet, because it was not writing as the Spanish understood it, it was dismissed, destroyed, allowed to fade into obscurity. The loss is incalculable. Imagine the stories that were recorded on those quipus, the songs, the genealogies, the poems that described the creation of the mountains and the journeys of the gods. Imagine the histories of battles and alliances, of emperors and their deeds, of famines survived and enemies defeated. All of it encoded in knots, all of it carried through the mountains by runners, all of it stored in archives in Cusco, waiting to be read. And then, in the span of a few decades, almost all of it gone, burned or discarded, the Quipucamayos silenced, their knowledge scattered like ash on the wind. What remains are fragments, echoes, the thousand surviving quipus that sit in climate-controlled museum storage, carefully preserved but only partially understood. They are silent witnesses to a lost world, holding within their knots the memory of an empire that once stretched from the jungle to the sea, from the highlands to the desert coast. And perhaps, one day, through patience and ingenuity and a bit of luck, someone will find the key, will crack the code, will bring those voices back to life. Until then, the quipus wait, their knots tied centuries ago by hands long turned to dust, their secrets locked in patterns of color and chord and careful placement, an enigma wrapped in string. Segment 4, Life of the Elite at Machu Picchu. Now let the scene shift upward, away from the valleys where the Ayos toil, away from the plaza in Cajamarca where an empire fell, away from the quiet rooms where Quipucamayocs tie their knots. Rise with the mountain mist, climb through the clouds, and find yourself standing on a narrow ridge, 8,000 feet above the distant sea, surrounded by peaks that pierce the sky like the teeth of ancient gods. This is Machu Picchu, the royal estate of the Emperor Pachacuti, a sanctuary built not for the masses, but for the privileged few. You are no longer a laborer here, though laborers built every stone you see. You are a guest, perhaps, or a member of the nobility, or a priest attending the astronomical observations that mark the turning of the seasons. The air is cool and thin, but not as punishing as it is at higher elevations. Below you, the Urubamba River winds through the valley like a silver thread, its waters rushing over stones worn smooth by centuries of flow. Above you, the peak of Huayna Picchu rises like a sentinel, its slopes covered in vegetation so thick that the stone beneath is barely visible. And all around you, the estate spreads across the saddle between these peaks. Terraces cascading down the slopes, stone buildings with thatched roofs arranged in careful clusters, plazas where ceremonies unfold beneath the open sky. Machu Picchu is not a city, despite what later visitors will call it. It is a retreat, a place of power and prestige, where Pachacuti and his court come to relax, to hunt in the surrounding cloud forests, to conduct rituals, and to entertain foreign dignitaries. After the emperor's death, the estate will remain in the possession of his panaka, his kin group, his descendants, who will continue to visit, to maintain the buildings, and to honor his memory. At its height, perhaps 750 people live here, though most of them are not nobility. They are servants, retainers, aklas, farmers who tend the terraces, priests who conduct the ceremonies, guards who watch the narrow paths that lead up from the valley. The architecture here is extraordinary, even by Inca standards. The stones are cut with such precision that they fit together without mortar, their surfaces ground smooth, their edges sharp and clean. In the elite residential compounds clustered in the northeast sector of the site, the stonework is particularly fine, blocks of granite shaped to interlock perfectly, doorways carved with trapezoidal precision, niches set into the walls to hold offerings or sacred objects. These are the homes of Pachacuti's family, of the highest-ranking nobles, of those who have earned the privilege of residing in this mountain sanctuary. Imagine yourself entering one of these residences, stepping through a doorway into a cool, shadowed interior. The walls are thick, the air still. Sunlight filters through the trapezoidal window, illuminating the fine weave of a textile hanging on the wall, a piece woven by one of the Achelas, its patterns intricate, its colors vivid even in the dim light. The floor is swept clean. In one corner, a low platform serves as a bed, covered with soft alpaca blankets. In another, a series of ceramic vessels hold water, chicha, perhaps dried maize or quinoa. There is a quiet elegance to this space, a simplicity that belies the immense effort required to create and maintain it. Beyond the residential compounds lie the ceremonial spaces, the heart of Machu Picchu's spiritual life. The Temple of the Sun is perhaps the most remarkable, a semicircular structure built atop an enormous slab of granite, its walls curving gracefully, its stonework among the finest in the entire site. The building is oriented to capture the light of the rising sun during the winter solstice, when the sun's rays pour through a trapezoidal window and illuminate a stone altar within. This is where the priests conduct rituals to honor Inti, the sun god, the supreme deity of the Inca pantheon. Only the priests and the highest nobility are permitted to enter this sacred space. The rest must observe from a distance, watching as offerings are made, as chicha is poured out onto the stone, as chants rise into the mountain air. Beneath the Temple of the Sun lies a natural cave, its walls carved and smoothed by Inca stonemasons. Some scholars believe this space served as a royal tomb, a place where the mummy of Pachacuti might have been kept for a time, honored and tended by his descendants. The Inca did not bury their dead and forget them. They kept the mummies of their emperors, dressing them in fine cloth, offering them food and drink, consulting them on matters of state. If Pachacuti's mummy was indeed brought here, it would have resided in this dark, cool chamber, watching over the estate he built, a silent presence at the ceremonies conducted above. Higher up the slope, at the highest point of the urban sector, stands the Intihuatana stone. The name means hitching post of the sun, and the stone itself is a masterwork of astronomical precision. It is carved from a single block of granite, rising from the bedrock in a series of angular facets that culminate in a central pillar. This pillar is aligned with the sun's position during the equinoxes. On March 21st and September 21st, at midday, the sun stands almost directly above it, casting no shadow. At this moment, the Inca priests perform a symbolic ritual, tying the sun to the stone with a sacred cord, ensuring that it will not drift away, that it will continue its journey across the sky, that the seasons will turn as they should. The Intihuatana is more than a calendar or a timepiece. It is a statement of Inca cosmology, a physical manifestation of the relationship between the divine and the earthly, between the movements of the heavens and the rhythms of human life. The priests who tend this stone are astronomers, keepers of knowledge passed down through generations, men who can predict the solstices and equinoxes with astonishing accuracy. They observe the stars, the planets, the phases of the moon. They chart the movements of the constellations, understanding that the heavens govern the planting and harvest, the timing of festivals, the proper moments for rituals and ceremonies. Imagine standing beside the Intihuatana at dawn, the sky lightening from black to deep blue to pale gold. The priest raises his hands, chanting in Quechua, calling to Inti to rise, to bring warmth and light to the world. And then the sun appears, cresting the ridge to the east, its rays spilling across the mountains, illuminating the terraces, the buildings, the stones of the Intihuatana itself. For a moment, the entire estate seems to glow, bathed in golden light, and you feel the presence of something vast and incomprehensible, the turning of the cosmos made visible. Below the elite residences and the temples, the Akalahuasai, the House of the Chosen Women, occupies a prominent position within the site. This is where the Akalas live, young women selected at the age of 8 or 10 for their beauty, their lineage, and their potential for spiritual devotion. They are sometimes called the Virgins of the Sun, and they are among the most respected individuals in the empire, though their lives are governed by strict discipline and constant supervision. The Aklas have multiple duties. They weave the finest textiles, producing cloth so delicate and intricate that it is reserved for the emperor, for the highest nobles, for the gods themselves. They prepare ritual food, grinding maize into flour, cooking ceremonial dishes, and brewing chicha, the fermented maize beer that is essential to Inca religious life. The process of making chicha is labor-intensive and surrounded by ritual. The maize must first be germinated, which develops the sugars necessary for fermentation. It is then dried, ground, and slowly cooked for hours before being transferred to large clay vessels where it ferments for several days, developing its characteristic sour, slightly sweet taste. The éclas oversee this process with care, ensuring that the chicha is of the highest quality, suitable for offerings to the gods and for consumption during festivals and ceremonies. Life within the Asalahuasi is highly structured. The young women live under the supervision of older priestesses, learning the skills required for their roles, participating in religious rituals, and maintaining their vows of chastity. Some Akalas will spend their entire lives in service to Inti, never marrying, dedicating themselves wholly to the spiritual and productive work of the empire. Others, particularly those of noble lineage, may be given in marriage to men who have distinguished themselves in service to the state. Generals, administrators, foreign nobles whose loyalty the emperor wishes to secure. To receive an Aquila as a wife is among the highest honors the emperor can bestow. Imagine the Akalas at work in the Akalahuasi, their hands moving deftly over looms, weaving patterns of red and gold and deep indigo into cloth that will adorn the emperor's litter or be draped over the altar in the Temple of the Sun. Imagine them grinding maize, the rhythmic sound of stone on stone echoing through the building, their voices rising in song as they work. Imagine them carrying vessels of chicha through the narrow streets of Machu Picchu, heading toward the plaza where a ceremony is about to begin, their movements graceful and precise, their expressions serene. The agricultural terraces that surround Machu Picchu are as much a part of the estate's grandeur as its temples and palaces. These terraces cascade down the slopes in long, elegant curves, each one carefully engineered to prevent erosion, to manage water, and to create microclimates suitable for different crops. The upper terraces, which receive the most sunlight, are planted with maize, tall stalks that sway in the mountain breeze, their ears ripening under the sun. The lower terraces, cooler and more humid, are planted with potatoes, oca, and other tubers that thrive in these conditions. The terraces are not only functional, they are beautiful, a demonstration of the Inca ability to harmonize human construction with the natural landscape. Water is channeled through underground conduits and small storage pools, ensuring that each level receives exactly the right amount of moisture. During the rainy season, the terraces absorb the deluge without collapsing or washing away. During the dry season, the stored water is carefully rationed, distributed to the crops in a manner that maximizes yield. The produce from these terraces feeds the residents of Machu Picchu, the nobles, the priests, the Aklas, the servants. But the estate also receives goods from the valleys below: fresh fruit, coca leaves, dried fish from the coast, exotic items brought from distant provinces as tribute. The storehouses at Machu Picchu are stocked with jars of chicha, with dried meat, with carefully folded textiles. This is a place of abundance, at least for those privileged enough to reside here. Info Peru. Feasts are held regularly, particularly during the solstices and equinoxes, when the astronomical alignments are celebrated with elaborate ceremonies. Tables are laden with roasted guinea pig, with maize cakes, with stews flavored with ají peppers. Chicha flows freely, poured from ceramic vessels into wooden cups, offered first to the gods, then to the Sapa Inca or his representatives, and finally to the assembled guests in order of their social rank. Musicians play panpipes and drums, their melodies drifting across the plaza, mingling with the chants of the priests and the murmur of conversation. Dancers move in synchronized patterns, their costumes bright with feathers and gold ornaments, their movements telling stories of conquest, of harvest, of the eternal cycle of the seasons. Imagine yourself at one of these feasts, seated among the nobility, the stone walls of the plaza rising around you, the stars emerging overhead as the sun sets behind the western peaks. The air is filled with the scent of roasting meat, of maize beer, of wood smoke from the cooking fires. The conversation is animated but measured, conducted in low, respectful tones befitting the sacred nature of the occasion. You drink from your cup, savoring the slightly sour taste of the chicha, feeling its warmth spread through your body. You watch the dancers, their movements hypnotic, their footsteps echoing on the stone. And you feel for a moment the weight of empire, the sense of participating in something vast and enduring. A civilization that has conquered mountains and valleys, that has built roads and bridges and terraces, that has organized the labor of millions and created beauty in the most improbable of places. But even here, even in this sanctuary of privilege and power, there is an awareness of fragility. The civil war between Atahualpa and Huascar has torn the empire apart. The Spanish have landed on the coast, and rumors of their strange weapons and their ruthless ambition are beginning to spread. The world is changing, and no amount of astronomical precision, no perfection of stonework, no abundance of chicha and feasting can stop what is coming. Machu Picchu will be abandoned, though not destroyed. When the Spanish consolidate their control over the highlands, when the old order collapses and the new order takes its place, the residents of this royal estate will leave, walking down the narrow paths that lead to the valley, carrying what they can, leaving behind the stones, the terraces, the temples. The jungle will reclaim much of the site, vines creeping over the walls, trees sprouting from the plazas. For centuries, Machu Picchu will remain hidden, known only to a few local families who farm the terraces and shelter in the ruins. And then in 1911, it will be rediscovered, brought back into the light, transformed into a symbol of a lost civilization, a place where tourists come to stand and marvel and try to imagine what life was like when the Atlas wove their cloth and the priests tied the sun to the Intihuatana, and the nobility feasted beneath the stars. But tonight, in this moment, the estate is alive, vibrant, a testament to what human ingenuity and ambition can achieve even in the most challenging of environments. The fires burn in the hearths, the chicha flows, the priests chant their prayers to Inti, and high above, the constellations turn slowly across the sky, indifferent to empires, indifferent to the rise and fall of civilizations, eternal and unchanging. And now, as the stars wheel overhead and the night deepens, let yourself drift gently back to the present. You have walked the steep mountain paths with the mitayos, felt the thin air burn in your lungs, hauled stones until your hands bled and your back screamed in protest. You have stood in the plaza at Cajamarca, witness to the moment when an empire was undone by treachery and technological advantage, when the last independent Inca emperor was pulled from his golden litter and made prisoner. You have held the quipu in your hands, feeling the knots that once encoded the history of a civilization, now silent and enigmatic, their secrets locked away. And you have climbed to Machu Picchu, that sanctuary in the clouds, where the elite lived in splendor, where the sun was tied to stone, and where the terraces cascaded down the slopes like green rivers frozen in time. The Inca Empire was built on labor, the collective effort of millions of ordinary people who gave their time, their strength, and sometimes their lives to construct roads, terraces, temples, and cities. It was organized with astonishing precision, governed by quipus that tracked every detail, sustained by a system of reciprocity that, at least in theory, balanced obligation with protection. But it was also a world of profound inequality, where a small elite enjoyed comfort and privilege, while the masses toiled in thin mountain air and cold stone quarries. It was a world of beauty and brutality, of astronomical sophistication and backbreaking labor, of exquisite textiles woven by young women who would never wear them, and feasts attended by nobles who had never hauled a stone. And it was fragile. For all its roads and fortresses, for all its quipus and carefully organized storehouses, The empire could not withstand the combination of internal division and external invasion. A civil war weakened it. A handful of Spanish conquistadors, armed with steel and gunpowder and a willingness to employ treachery, shattered it. The stones remain at Machu Picchu, at Cusco, at countless sites scattered across the Andes, but the civilization that built them is gone. Its language encoded in knots we can no longer fully read, its stories carried away on the wind. As you settle into your bed tonight, far from the cold Andean peaks, far from the plazas where empires fell and the temples where the sun was worshipped, take comfort in the distance. You will not wake before dawn to haul stones at altitude. You will not be pulled from your throne and held for ransom. You will not spend your life tying knots into cords or weaving cloth for gods and emperors. The rhythm of the meter, the cycle of labor and obligation, no longer governs your days. The world has changed, and whatever burdens you carry, they are not the burdens of an Inca commoner. Let the images fade now. The terraces, the temples, the knotted cords, the golden litter stained with the memory of violence. Let the sounds quiet. The chanting of priests, the rhythmic grinding of stone on stone, the screams in the plaza at Cajamarca. Let yourself drift gently and easily into sleep, into dreams that are your own, unburdened by empire, by altitude, by the weight of stones carried up mountains by hands long turned to dust. The Inca are gone, but their stones remain, silent witnesses to what was and what could never last. And you, resting comfortably in the present, are free to close your eyes and let the past recede, a story told, a journey completed, a history remembered, and then mercifully released into the quiet darkness of sleep. Good night.